My estranged dad just escaped from prison and showed up at my door. Now he wants to make things right, but it could make me an accomplice to his crimes. I know you may think this story is exaggerated, or even not true, but I assure you, every word of this happened in the exact way you are about to hear. It started with a knock at my door at 3 a.m., more like a pound really, and there was no way that the 26-year-old F me was going to answer the door without packing heat. It may sound extreme to you to answer the door with a gun, but in my neck of the woods that's just how we roll. Right or wrong, I guess it's something my dad taught me to do when I was a kid and I never broke the habit. But Dad didn't just answer the door armed when there were strange pounds in the middle of the night, which there were plenty of. He did it when the mailman came by. And he also slept with one under his pillow. Thankfully that's a habit I never picked up. I crept down the hallway and to the front door, and can only imagine my surprise when I peeped through the peephole only to find the man himself staring back at me. It was my father, Earl, looking ragged and filthy, like he'd just crawled out of a sewer drain. And as it turns out there was a very good reason why he looked that way. As always in his life, he had an excuse. But this time it was for real. My dad was in prison, you see. Well, I guess he technically was in prison. He was sentenced to 15 years for armed robbery a year ago and we've been no contact ever since. Not that he'd been a consistent part of my life to begin with. He was always in and out of jail or rehab, promising he'd changed, that he was a new man, only to split with all my mom's money after only a few months. But the thing is, before he got busted for the robbery, he'd actually been doing well for a long time. He'd been sober for over a year, which was the longest he'd ever been, and when he reached out and I agreed to coffee, I saw a genuine difference in him. At least I thought I did. But then he decided to hold a Panera hostage with one of the massive sandwich knives, and the judge made sure he got the max this time. My dad's lawyer claimed that it was a substance abuse issue. I guess he was out of his mind on something and thought demons were after him or something. What can I say? My dad's messed up. And it's a good thing in the end that he was never around. I was standing in the hallway in the dark, clutching the pistol, everything feeling like some surreal dream. For a second I thought I was still asleep, and this was all just some terrible nightmare. Surely my criminal father had not escaped from prison and shown up at my door? But then of course I heard him call my name, and even though I'd hardly heard that voice in my life, it triggered a deep and soul-stirring reaction. I couldn't help but want to help him for the very reason that he was my dad. To the police he was a dangerous fugitive, but he wouldn't hurt me, would he? I decided not to risk it for now. He asked again to come in, louder this time. I guess my tiptoeing wasn't quiet enough because he now knew that I was on the other side of the door. "Come on honey," he said. "I know I'm putting you in a bad spot but I really need you to help me out." I asked him what happened, how the heck did he even get here, and to his credit he was completely honest. He was able to cut a hole through the fence with some contraband tools. It took him about 3 months but he finally did it tonight. And for some reason my house was the first place that he thought of to come to. When I asked him why that was, he basically said in so few words that there was no place else he could go to. There was no one in Dad's life that trusted him anymore. He'd burned every bridge he ever had, and even his old criminals buddies weren't going to risk getting caught harboring a wanted fugitive. But was I about to? He begged me to let him in, and looking through the peephole, I saw a pleading in his eyes I'd never seen in another human being. Deep down I knew it was a front, that there was a 99% chance that it was all bullcrap and he was leading me on, but I guess I have more of my mother in me than I thought. My hand suddenly went for the doorknob seemingly involuntarily, almost subconsciously, like how a planchette moves across a Ouija board. And then I let him cross the threshold into my home. Was my father the devil, or just a man in need? My mom was very religious. She still is very religious. I think her horrible experience with my dad sort of drove her into God's arms. So she would say that this is a very clear-cut case of a wolf in sheep's clothing type situation. That the devil comes in many forms you can trust, and to always be wary of the great deceiver and all that jazz. If I called her up for advice about this current predicament she'd probably try to get a priest over here for an exorcism as soon as possible. Then she blessed the house with sage once a week until we sold the house at a steep discount. Yeah, that wasn't going to happen. But if my mom truly believed what she said she did, then she would take pity on the sinner. She would take him in, right? Right or wrong, for the time being at least, this is what I ended up doing. He came in rather nervously, almost like a kid in an antique store who's been told not to touch anything, although I don't own a single antique. In fact, now that he was inside, he was the oldest thing in the house. Although I actually would rather he not touch anything now that I thought of it. He said he had to hide in a drainage ditch for an hour to cover up his scent from the dogs. Just wow, I thought. Is this crap really happening? I gave him a large glass of water from the sink. I decided that all he was getting was tap water for now, and my own bottled stuff was off limits. That would be my mental line to myself that I wouldn't cross. If he started drinking my sparkling cranberry lime, I'd be officially harboring a fugitive. I let him take a shower and change his clothes, and having no idea what to do with this filthy prison uniform, just shoved it in the wash. I started to think about how all this dirt and grime going down my drain was actually from the state prison, and then I thought about how I was the one doing my dad's laundry. How many times had my poor mother washed his clothes after he'd done some crime? How many times had she unknowingly been tricked into concealing evidence and being an accessory after the fact? But this situation was different. I wasn't an accessory after the fact, I was an accessory during the fact. And I suddenly realized that I was committing a crime. He took absolutely forever in the shower. I laid out some clothes my old boyfriend Miguel had left behind and made him some eggs and toast and had it waiting for him, but it was all cold by the time he was finally done. But I have to be honest, I was surprised by how handsome he looked. When he showed up at the door he was all scraggly and long-haired, with a week-old beard and a unibrow. But now his hair was closely cropped, and his face and brow were shaved down to the skin. I was training to be a barber inside, he said. I told him he looked nice and watched him sit down to eat, which he was annoyingly verbal about his gratefulness for. I assumed that I'd go to the bathroom and find it covered in stringy, sweaty salt and pepper hair, but to my surprise the entire floor, counter and tub was spotless. He'd cleaned everything after he was done, and there was not a hair in sight. I came out and asked him what happened in there and where all the hair was, and he said he'd already bagged it all up and taken it out to the trash. I have no idea where I was while this was going on, but I was thankful nonetheless. But then something deeply disturbing and more likely than not occurred to me. It hit me like a ton of bricks. This guy was playing me yet again and it was so obvious this time. Look, I said, you can stay here and clean up and eat this, but after that you have to go, okay? He looked at me all hurt, like a stray puppy I was turning away. He pleaded with me, asking me what else he was supposed to do and where else he was supposed to go. I tried my best to keep eye contact with him but I couldn't help but look away. I can't be harboring a fugitive, I told him. You're a criminal, remember? He looked at me for a long time and then said something that I couldn't believe. You know I'm innocent of that crime, right hun? Considering his drug-induced freakout was recorded on Panera's security cameras and half the store got it on their phones and uploaded it within the hour, I'd say the evidence was pretty clear. But then he got really quiet for a long time, and told me a story about my grandpa that I never knew. He was in and out of jail too, you see. And this life was all he knew. But there was never anything about it that he loved. Sadly, it was only ever about funding his many addictions. I told him that was no excuse, and he said he knew it wasn't. It's still a crime to threaten everyone in Panera with a big carving knife, whether you have substance abuse issues or not. I think my dad understood that, but I wasn't exactly sure. But I decided to be honest with him too, and I told him that just because he's had his issues, and he had a crappy dad, doesn't mean he gets to escape prison. I then said something that finally got through to him. It actually pierced all of that armor that he'd built up over the years more than anything that happened in prison ever could. I told him that I had a dad who was a criminal too, and I turned out just fine. Sure, he was hurt and ashamed of the fact that his only daughter thought of him as simply a criminal. But I think a part of him was also proud of me. Because he could look round my home and see what I made for myself, and see that I was a good enough person to feed and clothe him, and that was something to be proud of. Even though he didn't raise me, he still felt he could take a little bit of responsibility in how well I turned out. The sun was beginning to rise and there hadn't been any reports of an escaped prisoner in the area. We assumed the guards had not figured out he'd busted out yet, but it was only a matter of time. Dad started asking me for all of the usual things you'd need to live as a fugitive on the run. He wants some cash that he promised to pay back. He needed my car that he assured me he'd take care of. He couldn't decide on Mexico or Canada, so figured he'd just get out to the crossroads and flip a coin. I could tell that he was tired. Exhausted, actually. His heart just wasn't in this. Could he have secretly wanted to bust out just to see me again? Of course he'd never be able to admit that. Not even to himself. Dad was obviously never very good at displaying his emotions in a healthy way. I decided that my best bet would be to tell him what I'll think about, then let him get some rest. When he falls asleep, I can figure out what the best course of action is. Obviously everyone in the comments is going to have a million things to say, and I can guess what the consensus is going to be. And believe me, yes, I'm going to call the police. I just want to make sure I do it right. In a way that won't get him, or me killed. Update 1. Calling the cops and telling them you're in the process of committing a crime was definitely something I'd never done before. And I had no idea how to do it without getting my door busted down by a SWAT team. Instead of going about it head on, I told the 911 operator that I had information about an ongoing crime and that I could only speak to a lieutenant about it. I didn't know if a lieutenant was who I should be talking to, but to my surprise she put me right through. He said his name was Lieutenant Cromley. And no, that wasn't his real name, but you have to admit it sounds pretty cool. I told Lieutenant Cromley that my father had just come into my home a few hours ago saying he was a fugitive and had just broken out of prison. Knowing that he was a convicted armed robber and in fear of my life, I tried my best to appease him until I had a chance to call authorities. I used my best frightened girl voice and there was no way it did not work on him. A black and white story was easy to understand. How could I even begin telling him about the complicated dynamics between a girl and her criminal father? I told him that my dad was sleeping now, passed out and snoring like a log, and there was no way he'd wake up even if somebody came into the house. He said that he would personally show up with the SWAT team to apprehend the felony escapee. I told him I didn't really know if sending a whole SWAT team was necessary, and maybe he could just send 1 or 2 guys, but he said it was standard operating procedure in cases like this. I figure they're not exactly going to be gentle when storming my castle. So here we are, and I never thought that I would say this, but the cops are on their way to my house to drag my dad out of my spare bedroom, because he just freaking escaped from prison. And I also never thought I would have ratted him out, but what other position had he put me in? If it had gone on any longer, the higher the chances were of myself getting charged with a crime. All I can do now is wait on the front steps and hope that he doesn't wake up before they get here, or as they come in. I really don't want to see him put up a fight. Update 2. It's been a wild few hours, but now that I'm finally done giving all of my statements to the authorities, I can finally bring everyone up to date. Thanks for all your concerns. First of all, I didn't really get a chance to see any of them until now for obvious reasons. I haven't even really gotten a chance to breathe either. But yes, the SWAT team came and dragged my fugitive father out of my house. And sadly, he made that literally the case. He cried like a little boy having a tantrum and being dragged out of a Toy Story. It was the most pathetic thing I'd ever seen a grown man do. I realized that my father had not changed and never would, and that I was a fool to even entertain the notion that he had. Of course I'm a good-hearted fool though, and I have to remember that I can still protect myself from people like my father without becoming cynical. I can learn from this horrible experience. I've already learned a few things actually. Like if you happen to know that the SWAT team is showing up at your door, it's a good idea to just keep it open for them. So now my dad is back in jail and will probably have more years tacked onto his sentence, and I'm left wondering if, since I'm not being charged with any crimes, will the department be reimbursing me for my busted down door? Something tells me no.